usual thing. I need to adjust. Good morning, first of all, to everybody. It's very nice to be here. I was not able to be here yesterday because I was in another program in Berlin. Came in last night, and I'm very happy now to be here. Thanks a lot to Isil for the invitation. It's always great to come to the programs of the International Society, truly international, because, well, earlier Ken Lee, and Chris and a few others met in Bratislava. This is only a couple of weeks ago, really. We also had the Shanghai Austrian Economic Summit over there, where Craig came and other people were there. So it's really an international society, and coming to such a sleepy town here, but seeing all these international people is really just very delightful. Alphonse is here, which is very personally for me very nice, because when we started the think tank MBA, you mentioned it, Alphonse Crespo was, I think, in the first year, 2008, when we started it. This November we have the next one. So I'm here to talk about Singapore, and at the end I do a little bit of an advertorial on the Atlas programs as well, if you don't mind, a little bit of commercial at the end of that. But right now, Singapore is where I'm based. For the last 2 years, I created my company there. And now that I'm going from Singapore, I often get that response, oh, Singapore. Great country, isn't it? And I'm always a little surprised how often I hear that and where I hear that. So I started to wonder, do we have a case of Libertarian Orientalism, actually? Who are among the admirers of Singapore? Very much so President Saakashvili of Georgia. When you go there, everybody talks about the Singapore model. You go on and you find that the Communist Party of China also really likes the Singapore model. Well, if you are in Africa, there's a big fan of Singapore over there. It's the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso. And then there are the libertarians. And you wonder, whoa, how does that all go together? And you look at this little website, gettingoutofamerica.com, that says those of the libertarian persuasion, this tiny city-state has long represented their idea of a free market Valhalla. Woo, big terms. So I was really wondering, how is it all? So I'm here actually to ask you what to make out of all that, and you will have to give me the answers when we have the discussion later. What libertarians see mostly is a couple of impressive facts. This is just ranking in the world. GDP per capita, 3rd out of 187 nations. Economic freedom ranking, 2nd out of 144. Global competitiveness, 2nd out of 144. Ease of doing business, 1st of 185. And I don't think libertarians look much at the Human Development Index, but if you have a quick peek at it, it would also be quite impressive. It's 18 out of 187. So that is really impressive, and that makes a lot of governments look at Singapore. See, that's what I'm talking about. This is so village-like when I hear this. First of all, I must say, a lot of people really don't know where Singapore actually is. So I don't know whether everybody here knows where it is. There it is. That tiny little spot inside the yellow circle. And on any reasonable map, you have to circle it, otherwise it's really too small. Some images that I want to share. This is actually there at the tip of Malaysia, at the Malaysian Peninsula, that little island. It's an island, actually. The Merlion used to be the symbol of the city-state. Now it's really more the 3 towers, the Marina Bay Sands with that swimming pool on top of the roof, like a arc on top, and Singapore Airlines, to those who fly a lot in this society, Singapore Airlines is definitely a preferred choice. Okay, let's now make the bridge from Singapore to libertarian principles. What are libertarian principles? Quickly, I believe, no, actually I'm quoting here, 3 principles: individual rights, one, that we have the right to live the life that we want to live, the way we want to live it, individually. We definitely think it needs a spontaneous order where we basically things and institutions and processes and procedures arrange themselves in a spontaneous way. And thirdly, of course, there needs to be limited government. And I'm quoting here from a speech that David Boaz once gave. And I like these kind of simplified things. It helps a lot. So 3 simple principles: individual rights, spontaneous order, and limited government. I don't think in this audience here, in front of this audience, I need to explain on any of that. And I thought, okay, then let's do a libertarian checklist. Looking at Singapore, how does it score? Individual rights. Well, first of all, there is no freedom of expression. Even giving that speech here, I must admit, when you have a permanent residence in Singapore, you think twice what you say. It's strange, but it is. You have to be careful. This is what a minister has to say. It is important for us to ensure that Singaporeans read the right thing. The right thing. That's the attitude. That's a typical statement from the government in Singapore. We want to make sure people consume the right kind of information. He had to say that to BBC. Now, in June, they came up with a new idea. Any website that reports about Singapore and has more than 50,000 unique visitors needs to pay a performance bond, which is a $50,000 license, or in US dollars, 39,000 US dollars license, to be allowed to do so. This basically kills the most critical and underfunded websites that do report independently about Singaporean politics. And no surprising then that the Freedom House would rank Singapore as only partly free, scores 4 out of 7, which basically means political rights and civil liberties are not guaranteed, especially the press in the country is not free. The newspaper there is a joke. It's really great if you need to wrap fish or if you want to clean your windows, but for anything else, it's really not really worthwhile. And this you can say in Singapore because everybody thinks so. Then there is no sex in the city, or more precisely, no gay sex in the city. It is criminalized according to the laws that mutually consenting adult men cannot have sex with each other. Oral sex was prohibited, and everybody was wondering which position in police would actually be in charge of checking on that. There was very big demand for that job, but now they legalized it in 2007. And actually, Singapore is liberalizing because the people are fed up with this kind of government. There are changes happening in Singapore now, and you can see, for example, a gay movement, the Pink Dot movement. This year, in 2013, they had a massive outpour of people who all wear pink. You can't make big statements, but you can wear pink and sit in the park. So that's the Pink Dot movement, and they were very successful this year. People are just fed up with being told what to think and what to do. The political opposition, well, they had a lot of choices between prison and bankruptcy. Singapore went so far that the government actually had an appointed member of opposition in the parliament, because they thought it's quite bad, the image, if it's all government. We need some opposition, so they appointed a member of the parliament to be the opposition. People thought it was also not a good idea. So that has also changed, because you can see now rallies of the opposition party, which unfortunately is the Workers' Party, have massive outpour again. And if you go by the electoral vote, it's quite close for the government to actually lose power. Could happen. So things are changing. The strong man isn't there, or he is there, but he is not in power anymore. It's his son, and his son is softer than daddy. Okay, so looking at our libertarian checklist on the individual rights, not really. On this one, Singapore definitely failed. You can't call that a libertarian system oppressing individual rights. And I'm only giving you some examples. I can't give you the entire talk about everything in Singapore. Then let's have a look at the spontaneous order. Of course, the first thing we think about is, spontaneous order, can everybody engage in business? Can you create a company? Can you do business, etc.? And you saw already that Singapore is ranking very well in this report. And this is truly the case. Singapore ranks #1 in the world in this report. And already in the first indicator, starting a business, it says it takes 3 procedures and 3 days to start a company. This is actually not quite right. I started my own company. It takes about 3 hours. It's amazing. I mean, you can spend your day creating companies because it's so easy. It's really no problem. So That is truly amazing. The only thing that takes a little while is for your bank then to check whether you're actually worthy having a bank account. So that is, you know, the usual, what banks do takes, what, 2 days or something. That's the little thing that you're waiting for to open your your corporate bank account. I'm also starting a business at the moment in Indonesia, and I can tell you it takes longer and it costs a lot of money, but not in Singapore. That one is fantastic. So that speaks a lot for spontaneous order to have this, starting a business like this. Then if you look at the top right, the one in red, trading across borders ranks 1. So free trade, definitely, that's the hallmark of Singapore. And that's why we see Singapore, I think, the way we look at it, like a libertarian Valhalla, if you want to. Free trade is really what Singapore is all about internationally. However, I'm always trying to find the hair in the soup. Here's one about enforcing contracts. Suddenly, out of brilliant performance, enforcing contracts isn't as good. It's only ranking 12 because it takes a lot of procedures and 150 days to enforce your contract. So there seems to be something not as brilliant, but in terms of starting a business and trading across borders, Singapore definitely excellent performance. What I try to do is I try to look now mostly at the Economic Freedom of the World report, give you some figures from the Fraser Institute's report. Here as well, freedom to trade internationally, you can see Singapore in 2010 ranks 2 with a score of 8.86. So basically that also underlines the same thing. Free international trade, Singapore, absolutely brilliant performance. And this goes really to the philosophy and the rationale of the country. Raffles started it saying this is a free trade spot in Southeast Asia when he basically took it away from the Malay rulers and gave it to the British Empire. He was the one who created Singapore. He has to have that little statue there. Sometimes the statue is shown with a couple of pigeons on his head, but I try to be more respectful. No pigeon here. But Raffles was the one who started the whole thing and said this is going to be a free trade place, and this free trade principle has never been touched in the last 150 years. And therefore, Singapore really, if you look at all those international indicators, Singapore scores extremely well. Very little regulation. A foreigner can create a company. Multinationals come in, no problem. It's all very easy. The hair in the soup, big hair this time. We're talking about government enterprises and investments. Here, Singapore only scores 7 in the Fraser Institute's report. And score 7 meant actually when the government invests between 20 and 25% of total investment is 20 or 25% of total investment. So, well, that's why I mean it's a big hair. That's a lot of money invested by the government and not by the private sector. And indeed, Singapore is characterized by its GLCs, the government-linked companies. They are, how do you define them? For those that are not familiar with that term, they have commercial objectives and the government has a direct controlling stake. Direct controlling stake means the government appoints board of directors, senior management, makes the decisions like on strategy, acquisitions, and divestments, etc. So you don't need to have 100% of a company to control it. There's a much smarter way. And these GLCs are professional companies, commercially run, but the government has a major stake in them, which also the IMF says there's a significant presence of GLCs in Singapore. And at the end of the statement of the IMF, it would say that they are being rewarded in financial markets. They are not just treated like any other market player. Of course, they have privileges. And other players in the market will sense this. So spontaneous order with giant companies dominating the Singapore markets, not really. Singapore GLC produced 60% of the nation's GDP. So that's not small fish. This is very big. And they are owned by the Temasek Holdings, the holding company of the government, with a portfolio of 173 billion in March. And all the major companies are basically GLCs. Airlines, telecommunications, engineering, all the media companies, land development, shopping mall development, the port authority, the power and the garbage and the marine and the subway and everything is GLC. You will read a lot about privatization in the history of those companies. Privatization means the government sells 20% of its 70% and now owns 50% and still appoints all the directors and so on and so on. So on the Libertarian Checklist, I would say yes, free trade, absolutely brilliant. In terms of GLC, domination of the economy, not so much. So, I mean, a mixed score, basically, on this principle of a libertarian system. And then finally, limited government. So what about the actual government involvement in the nation? And here, of course, you first of all look at the tax rate. And I think this is common sense. Everybody know, a lot of people know about this. It's actually great. If you look at it in terms of taxes, there is a Valhalla. And they score 10. No surprise. And I live there now. I pay my income tax. I pay my corporate tax. I agree. If you look at Singapore personal income tax rate, you know, if you just look at, let's say you earn 160,000 Singapore dollars a year, that would be 100,000 euros in a year. What is that? 125,000, 130,000 US dollars a year. You pay 15% personal income tax. Coming from Europe, that is quite nice. That leaves a lot for you. I know we want to keep it even lower, but generally speaking, in comparison, that is quite remarkable. On top of this, it's not always just the level of tax, right? It's also how much time and effort you spend on actually doing your taxes. When I came there and then there was the point where I had to do my tax declaration, I was like, oh my God, now I have to, and I have, okay, I need to find a day when I do this, sit down. And I sat down, I switched on the computer, it's all online. Took me 5 minutes. And I was done. That's the time when you go and have a coffee and think, it's a good place. You just put in the number that you tell the authorities that you earned. No receipts or what. You just say, that's how much I earn. Then you say whether you support parents, and then there's extra category for handicapped parents, whether you support children / handicapped children, whether you pay in your pension fund, then you say, okay, send. After that, it says already, you will probably have to pay this amount of money. But wait for your written statement. Then the written statement comes and that says the amount. And then you can pay either in one go or you can pay in installments. My annual personal income tax, I'm happy to share that here, was $700. I decided to pay in one go. Absolutely brilliant. Corporate tax rate, well, not bad either. You know, look at all those countries. In Singapore, you have roughly 17, 18% corporate tax rate. If you compare that to all these other countries there, including Germany, where I'm from, also very good. For my company, the first 2 years, the first 100,000 revenues are free anyway. So far, since I'm a small company, haven't paid taxes yet. It's going to start soon though. Right, government consumption. So again, I'm looking for that hair. Scores very badly, right? 5.24. So I thought, oh, here I got it. Not libertarian. But I must say, hair isn't as thick as I thought. Yes, the score is quite bad. Only 5.24 out of 10. And I thought, well, what is the actual expenditure? About 10%. You can see that in crisis times, of course, government decides they know the answers, so they spend more of GDP. So it went up again, and now it's a little lower again to 10.32. And then I think maybe that has to do with the fact that the government earns a whole lot of money. I know this is a little populist and a little propaganda-like, but you know, I just want you to have a look at it. The Prime Minister earns 2.2 million Singapore dollars a year. Divide that by 1.6, you come to the euro. It's still way past. It's 1.5 million US dollars. No, more than that. 1.7, 1.8 million US dollars a year for the Prime Minister. And then the Deputy Prime Minister and the ministers. The ministers earn way beyond $1 million a year. For a country of 5 million people, that's a remarkable amount of money for your leaders. And supposedly this eradicates corruption. I don't know, really. But then as I said, the hair is thinner or smaller than I thought. 10.32%, right? Government consumption. Look at OECD. OECD in general, on the right-hand side, the red one, is about 17.5%. So in comparison to other OECD countries, that consumption is actually quite low and fits to the fact that their tax payments are relatively low. So this shows other countries which don't really have a functioning government at all and are not able to collect taxes and are not able to spend money, they have way lower government expenditures. But OECD countries with a fully developed bureaucracy that actually can reach into your pockets whenever they like, they all have, well, not all, but almost all have higher government expenditures than Singapore. Right, so finally then, again, to something where Singapore scores very well, and that is transfers and subsidies. Here it scores 10 again, it has to be acknowledged. Very famous statement by former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, we were dead against the welfare state. And that is really the rationale in Singapore. You don't want to kill initiative and entrepreneurship by creating a welfare state. That's common sense in Singapore. Of course, other people don't have that, don't share that common sense. For example, the Asian Development Bank, which recently just criticized Singapore for not spending enough on welfare, those 3.5%. And they say that basically this 3.5% consists of that CPF system. And I would like to spend a little time, I have a few minutes, I guess, to talk about the CPF system so that you just hear about alternatives to what you find probably in your countries. First of all, it says there is a principle of self-reliance. So it's a forced savings scheme. Instead of paying in a big pot and then when somebody retires, somebody draws from a pot that everybody has paid into, Singapore has individual accounts. So I pay for my retirement, etc., but I pay it into an account that is only my account. And when I retire, I draw money only from that account. Nobody else has access to that account. But I also don't really have access to that account until I retire. Unless it is for other reasons, and this would be education, health, and home ownership. So it's a retirement system, but that also allows to use those funds for a few defined other purposes, and that is children education, healthcare, as well as private home ownership. That's the CPF system. What you do is you pay into it. You see the usual thing. The employer pays a certain amount depending on the age of the employee, and the employee also has to pay into this a certain amount. That's that contribution rate that you see there. And then a total contribution reaches, when you are between 50 and 55, 32.5%. So it gradually reduces a little bit. And where's the money going to? You have your own account, as I said, but your own account has 3 sub-accounts, an ordinary account, a special account, and a MediSave account. And then percentage-wise, the money that you pay into your own accounts goes into 3 different sub-accounts. And here you see that the Ministry of Manpower, I have it on their website, is an essential tenet to the CPF system for healthcare, retirement, education, and home ownership. And you see, ordinary account you can use for housing if you buy an apartment, for certain investment purposes, but very limited, and for education. A special account is for retirement, and the MediSave is where you pay for your medical insurance premiums. That's that system, which has resulted in people being able to buy a home. Singapore's government has always stressed the importance of private home ownership. They were never creating a system where people rent their homes. And now 93% of all Singaporeans own their own home. That's remarkable. I don't know whether it's too small, but Singapore, on this statistics there, Singapore reaches this 90%. At the other end is Switzerland, with only, what, 32% or something, followed closely by Germany. Germany, almost everybody rents. I mean, less than half of the people own their own homes. Most people rent. Singapore, unthinkable. This is because they have saved their own CPF funds and they can use this to apply for a bank loan. for a mortgage and then buy their own home. What has to be said though, here's my hairs, one of the hairs again. 82% of Singaporeans live in flats organized by the government-owned Housing Development Board. So there's a massive government intervention behind the whole thing, building all these apartments, but then not renting them out, selling them to the people, because the government says if we rent them out, they will look terrible after a little while. If we sell them, people will take care of them, and we have great housing estates. But the whole thing, HDB, I tell you, there's so many rules in HDBs. Anybody who lived there, there's a whole HDB culture. Everybody has a door. Outside they have gates. In an HDB, you are not allowed to have just one gate. You have two doors so that it doesn't swing too much into the corridor. It must be two smaller ones. In private condominiums, the rest of the 18% live in private condominiums, are the places you can choose your gate, whatever you like, but not in an HDB. So it's highly regulated, the whole thing, but people own it. And actually, when Margaret Thatcher started her program for home ownership, she learned that from Singapore. That was an inspiration coming from Singapore, that you don't want people to rent their places. You want them to own their places. So all in all, I would give that the thumbs up in terms of limited government. Tiny little problems, yes, but generally speaking, I would say scores quite well in the area of like taxation and all these things. That's really quite good. Make it easy for people and don't put too much burden on people. So this is how I would rank it. Individual rights, no, you cannot live the life you like to. Government still thinks they know better how you should lead your life. Spontaneous order, partially, but big shadow cast by the GLCs, by the government-linked companies, but quite a limited government place. So I would say it does not really represent that libertarian idea of a free market Valhalla. I wouldn't believe this. I think the freedom of the individual actor is also important. Is it a case of Libertarian Orientalism? What is Orientalism? Nice quote here by a professor in Japan. It's the misseeing of the other through a veil of interpretations of reality. And these interpretations are often relatively impenetrable. So we project something into somebody else and then says, see, it works. There is a place very that way and then a long way, and there it really works. That's why you should do it. You have to be careful because there are people over there. They're also libertarians and they struggle with their Singaporean government, and they're really surprised when people here say, look at that libertarian island over there. You know, this it's a kind of a prejudice, and nothing is stronger than a prejudice, of course. So it's quite impenetrable. You have that, for example, when we talk about the holiness of the Dalai Lama all the time, but there is a lot of realpolitik when it comes to the Tibetans. And ask a lot of people who are totally pro-Tibetans in Europe where Tibet is and what the history of Tibet is and what are their actual problems over there and so on. This is one of those things where people struggle with their own society and try to break free by saying there's an ideal somewhere and project all their dreams onto this. So we have to be careful not to do that with Singapore. And maybe we have to do so by looking at those 5 indicators. Sometimes we need to wonder, is it really that those 5 do represent a libertarian ideal? Or are they a good measure? Or do we need to impose weights on them? Or do we do that implicitly by selecting those indicators? Well, the guys who wrote the report say, well, to them, what is more important for the mobility of an automobile? The motor, the wheels, or the transmission? Hard to say. Therefore, we make no attempt to weight the components in any special way. So they just basically put them all on the same weight next to each other. If GLC is not so much a problem in the country where they write this, so maybe then they just appear as one among many. But taxes have to be there because that is a big struggle for us in European and American societies. So sometimes the selection of indicators might lead us to a certain conclusion. I still totally believe in this report. Don't take it as a fundamental criticism of the report, but we just always need to see whether we put a certain bias by selecting indicators and maybe by the weight we give to them. This is what I had to say about Singapore. I told you at the end I have a little commercial, so don't click into any other channel. I was introduced as also being a senior fellow with the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, and we do the Atlas Think Tank MBA. And I just always want to take the opportunity to tell you, please check out the Atlas Leadership Academy. For those of you who are active in organizations who want to develop their libertarian think tanks and initiatives, there are people who support you in many, many different ways. You become a member in this network. Then there are think tank online trainings. There are freedom schools. There are certain flagship events. There are regional training programs. You don't always have to go to the States. You don't have to only stay in the internet. Sometimes you can meet in Asia, in Europe, in other places. There are webinars on very practical things, either fundraising, leadership skills, strategic development, you name it. And then there is the Think Tank MBA 2-week program. Alphonse can tell you all about it because he participated. It's a 2-week program where you develop a business plan, a detailed business plan for your think tank. All of this you find on the website of Atlas in the Atlas Leadership Academy. I'm happy to tell you more about it. I will be here for the rest of the program. Thank you so much for your attention.